Greg. And as we begin, we acknowledge that we are on the land of the traditional owners, and where I am, and I believe where Anne is as well, we're on the Boonwurrung land of the Kulin Nation. And we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And as we're only 3 weeks away from The Voice, we acknowledge the request for The Voice, and we stand with the Aboriginal people for this voice, for Makarrata, for an agreement, and for truth-telling. And now I'd like to introduce Anne Albie, Reverend, I was going to say Reverend Doctor, not Reverend Doctor, just Dr. Anne Albie. And Anne is a long-time biblical scholar, especially with the Gospel of Luke, and but she's also, worked across the board with peacemakers, Aboriginal people, and with ecological respects as well. So all of these are brought into her work on the biblical text, and she has been awarded the best book in theological studies in Australia for 2023. Here it is, Reading with the Earth. And so congratulations, Anne, on that. And she will speak to us, I believe, about some of the things that are in that book, and especially the new ways that we will look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. So, and also being, not only is she a biblical scholar and a general scholar, she's also a wonderful poet, and she's published many books of poetry and encouraged other poets as well. So thank you, Anne, and we'll look forward to your address. Thank you.
So, unmuting. Okay, thanks, Coralie. I just thought I better say that there were 2 book prizes, one for an established scholar and one for an emerging scholar. And Barbara Deutschmann got for this book, which I haven't read yet because it only arrived the other day, Creating Gender in the Garden, the Inconstant Partnership of Eve and Adam. Barbara Deutschmann got the emerging scholar one. And her book's out in paperback, which makes it a little bit more affordable. Mine's coming out in paperback next year, Coralie, apparently. So that's good. Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen. Since we're on Zoom, I thought I might as well use the opportunity for us to follow along with a PowerPoint. Okay. So everyone can see that okay? Yep. All right. And I tested the sound before, so I think we're okay. So I'll just go, let's see, can I go back? Okay. Yep. So I'm talking about a practice of braided reading, and I'm sure, a lot of this, at least the ideas of bringing these things together, won't be really new to people. But we'll see how we go. So I've subtitled it Entangled Approaches to the Parable of the Good Samaritan. And thank you, Coralie, for the acknowledgement of country. As Coralie said, I'm joining you today from Boonwurrung country, a slightly different part from where Coralie is, I think. I'm near Cannonook Creek and Port Phillip Bay in Seaford, Victoria. I acknowledge the lands, waters and skies of Boonwurrung country, and acknowledge the ancestors of this place, and pay my respects to the elders of the Kulin Nation, past and present, with hope for future generations. Okay. I invite you to join me in braiding stories, starting with deep red for land, blue for waters, white for skies, light green for kin, for persons human and other kind. This wide open kinship of place, people, stones, waters, breath, atmosphere, other animals and plants, a part of the entangled lives that breathe into and out of our readings. Let us add the Lucan text, often called the parable of the Good Samaritan, to this weave with a mauve thread. This is the version of the text that they use at Sophia's Spring, and I've forgotten the name of it, Coralie, but so I think it's an inclusive language version that they use at Sophia Spring in at Ceres Environmental Park. The parable of the Good Samaritan. An expert on the law seeking self-justification pressed Jesus further. And just who is my neighbour? Jesus replied, there was a traveller going down from Jerusalem to Jericho who fell prey to robbers. The traveller was beaten, stripped naked, and left half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. The priest saw the traveller lying beside the road, but passed by on the other side. Likewise, there was a Levite who came the same way. This one too saw the afflicted traveller and passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was taking the same road also came upon the traveller, and filled with compassion, approached the traveller and dressed the wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then the Samaritan put the wounded person on a donkey or a pack animal, went straight to an inn, and there took care of the injured one. The next day the Samaritan took out 2 silver pieces and gave them to the innkeeper with the request, look after this person, and if there is any further expense, I'll repay you on the way back. Which of these 3, in your opinion, was the neighbour to the traveller who fell in with the robbers? The answer came, the one who showed compassion, or mercy in the text, I think it says. Jesus replied, then go and do the same. So there are a few things in this text I will comment on as we weave. A pattern of compassionate responsiveness that I'll come back to. It links the Samaritan, Jesus in Luke 7, and the father in the parable of the lost child or son in Luke 15. A questioning of the usual reading of the Samaritan as an outsider or enemy, and a broader understanding of who and what contributed to the Samaritan's compassionate action. Next, a somber note. The reading today is situated, or the text is situated on a dangerous road, where a person is set upon and left half dead. In an ecological context, this calls to me the trauma of so many other creatures, left dead or half dead on the side of the road. The next thread is red. I take roadkill as a contemporary context against which to read the text. Now here's the old road. And let us view for a moment, and I have several images that may be a bit confronting. Some images taken in 2014 by Natasha Finn on roads in New South Wales, but similar images are repeated across the country. These images, used with her permission, form part of her photo essay, Impacts on the King's Highway, which runs, I think, between Canberra and the East Coast. So it goes through Braidwood, where Judith Wright lived, and Val Plumwood lived nearby. This trauma impacts not only the individual animals, but also, for example, in the case of kangaroos, the communities to which they belong. I'll return to this context shortly. So ecological hermeneutics, a green thread, asks us to exercise 3 hermeneutics. A hermeneutics of suspicion that the text might be a bit too human-focused. A hermeneutics of identification with other than human characters in the text. For example, the pack animal, or in the translation we had, donkey. And a hermeneutics of retrieval of the voices of other than human characters in the text, including the land itself. So I'm happy for you to ask about, expanding any of these things. Feminist theory, a purple ribbon. They're a bit hard to see against the purple background, or at least on my computer, but I hope you get the idea. Can remind us, among other things, that the road itself might be a place dangerous to women. Would a woman have travelled alone on such a road? Together, ecological and feminist perspectives inform us that oppression of women and ecological destruction have common roots in patriarchal or kyriarchal imaginaries that privilege certain kinds of power over others, and in colonial processes of economic progress and extractivism. So that extractivism is that sort of will to mine things, to take things, to extract from the land, particularly, where many people, land, and other creatures become resources or collateral damage for capitalist enterprise. A further perspective I take is a new materialist one, deep pink. And this informs my thinking about who has agency. Is it only humans, or is our every act already an exercise of co-agency with many other beings? Philosopher Jane Bennett argues that matter is vibrant, and everyday human actions occur as a complex of interactions with other than human beings or other than human things. This prompts me to notice that the Samaritan's compassionate action towards the stranger left on the side of the road requires not only the Samaritan, but another animal, as well as the innkeeper, the oil and wine and bandages, the food, and all the material things, including coins, that contribute to the healing and sustaining actions for the injured person. So compassionate action's always more than the action of one human person acting alone. So I want to also bring into this weaving, this mix, art. So with a yellow thread, I bring artwork into the mix. In relation to road trauma to other creatures, I want to share John Reed's artwork, Performance for 25 Passing Vehicles, Australia, Newell Highway, 23rd of July, 1989. And John did some time ago give me permission to put this in the book, so I'm assuming permission for today also. So here's his image, and this is what he says about it, what he did. So on noticing a dead kangaroo near a road sign, Reed decided to pull over. And I heard him talking about this some years ago, and he said he got that frisson that told him he had to make an artwork out of this in response to this thing. And what he did was he undressed and placed himself naked on the side of the road in the same orientation as the kangaroo, but at the opposite end of the sign. He maintained this pose while the performance was documented visually until 25 vehicles had passed. This, for him, was a performance of solidarity with the kangaroo and all those killed on the road. He writes, "For me, the work addresses our high energy, high speed, careless lifestyle and reasserts the proposition that our fate is bound up to the fate of other life around us. The performance was also a critique of systems and practices that deny human interconnectedness with other creatures. The image was made into a postcard as a reminder to others and ultimately to the artist himself, because artists and theologians are enmeshed in the structures they and we critique." An important aspect of Reed's performance artwork is resistance to the everyday prioritising of human lives over the lives of other creatures. Would we leave a human half dead or dead on the side of the road? Indeed, we probably would be legally obliged, not just morally obliged, to stop. Why is it okay to routinely do so for other creatures and to assent to the conditions, long-haul road freight, for example, that endanger their lives and treat them as expendable? And I'm not saying, it's not a comment on anyone else, it's a comment on myself as well, that we see things differently. And sometimes it's just not even safe to stop for the myriad creatures that we see on the road in some spots. So let me follow on with poetry as another thread, magenta, and share with you a poem I wrote some years ago, responding to the entanglements of a trip in South Australia to a place where my grandmother was born in Port Pirie. The poem is called Freight. Freight. My ravelled pasts uncoil along the level way I take to Spencer Gulf. The Murray stretches beside me, a diversion unseen in its shell. Its pipeline is like the lizard that warmed itself under the road train of nation. Strong curves lie on the verge, ochre hide and ruddy hind. The rust of the soil runs in Clare's wine, the lead of Pirie in the children's blood. Sheep are the colour of country. At Port Augusta I read that Flinders sailed until the water turned to ground. In his range's dry scrub maps the soil. I hug the road. A kingfisher holds to a dead limb. 3 emus pause in bough and peck beside a fence, while a raven tastes the blue tongue's broken flesh. For me, the poem situates the trauma of roadkill in the wider context of social and ecological justice, for example, colonial invasion, the health impacts of lead smelting in Port Pirie, the strain on the Murray River from upstream usages in other states. A further thread that informs my reading is critical race theory, for which I use a black thread. And I refer into particular to work by Zakiya Imam Jackson and Lavelle Secrest. So Lavelle Secrest calls into question traditional readings of the parable of the Good Samaritan that rely on setting up the Samaritan as other, and I'm sure you've heard those readings many times. She claims that this is not accurate. Both Jews and Samaritans were subject to the Torah, and an understanding of the parable should not rest on setting up an enmity between them. They are different, but in the world of the parable, the Samaritan is an insider, though not of the religious elite, like the 2 passers-by, the priest and the Levite, I think. Zakiya Imam Jackson argues that there is an intersection in the West between oppression based on race and devaluation of non-human animals. As a white woman, I need to be careful when speaking of her work, because as Jackson points out, the word animal has been used to devalue people of colour. Even the word human, she maintains, has been used as if it applies only to certain elite humans, not all of us. One aspect of her careful discussion suggests to me to look at the way the pack animal is a possession, however benignly it is treated by the Samaritan. How does the white possessive impulse that affects land and people of colour figure in the parable of the Good Samaritan? How is it unsettled by the parable? So a further thread, light pink, is queer theory. I've not worked to any extent in this area, but invite you to think about how LGBTIQ+ perspectives might be woven into a reading of this text. One aspect is the further unsettling of binaries, which is a keynote of ecological feminist thinking also. Allied with this is a rethinking of gender and kinship, expanding possibilities for thinking human and divine being, and perhaps a fresh sense of the fluid constancy of the sacred, materially and corporeally. A few years ago, reading some disturbing biblical Christian discourse on homosexuality, I started to ask why we don't make compassion, rather than some pseudo-literalist approach, a method for reading biblical texts. For compassion as method, I add a navy ribbon or thread. So I propose that we need to rethink compassion as not only for humans, but for other creatures too. But to simply extend compassion for humans to other creatures is to reinforce a separation between humans and animals. Rather, compassion needs to be understood as a more than human capacity. As human animals, we exercise compassion. So finally, I come to more traditional biblical criticism and the tan thread. Three stories in the Gospel of Luke: the resuscitation of the widow's child in 7 verse 11 to 17, the Good Samaritan parable with its surrounds in 10:25 to 37, and the lost child, or the prodigal son as it's traditionally called, in 15:11 to 32, portray a pattern of compassionate responsiveness in which seeing prompts compassion. These are moments of encounter with another person who is dead, near death, or socially dead. In each instance, the protagonist, Jesus, the Samaritan, the Father, is moved by compassion to act, to restore the person to life. This movement of compassion is gut felt. A basis for this exercise of compassion is the body. In Hebrew, the root rachem refers to both compassion and womb. In Koine Greek, the verb splunknidzomai, to have compassion or feel sympathy for, situates compassion in relation to the intestines, splunknon or splunkna. These etymological links between compassion, the maternal, and the corporeal are not incidental. Rather, they point to an understanding of the materiality of compassion, its roots in bodily encounter, subject to subject rather than subject to object, and its material givenness in relatedness with another. It is not simply a one-to-one relation, as if on the road only the injured animal and I were subjects in the moment. Rather, the exercise of compassion as a participant in and an emergent from the material givenness of relatedness reaffirms and enacts that relatedness as an earthly ethical reality. Compassion, like forgiveness and hospitality, is an aspect of the Lucan divine visitation. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, this compassionate action occurs on a road where another is left half dead. This is a dangerous habitat. Moreover, the road itself and the characters who pass along it point to its relatedness to systemic inequalities, conflicts, and resistances. The parable is situated in the wider Lucan program of good news, of liberation and healing set out in Luke chapter 4. The longed-for liberation has in its sights not only a spiritual liberation, but also forgiveness, aphasis, that is first release from the kinds of debt suffered under the economic and social systems of imperial Rome. What this suggests, among other things, is that in addition to the two who looked and passed on, retaining their relative privilege, there is a hidden character or set of characters in the parable of the Good Samaritan, and that is the Roman Empire, which promotes and makes possible the particular situation of inequality that renders the road to Jericho so risky for its travellers. Further in the parable, in its closing questions, there's a shift invited, a shift in perspective. The questioner, and so the reader or hearer of the story, is left not in the Samaritan's shoes, and several people have noted this before, but on the side of the road, receiving the Samaritan neighbour's compassion. One way we can inhabit this shift in perspective is to recognise with humility and in a kind of ecological conversion that all our makings, all our compassionate actions, and our receiving of sustenance and compassion from many others, as we stay with the trouble of systemic inequalities, are part of the entangled lives, are part of our material relatedness with other creatures. So just a few ideas to start off a discussion, I guess. That's the book that Coralie waved around before. I just thought I'd finish with the picture of the book. So I might stop sharing, and I think you said to take half an hour, but I took a tiny bit less. So hope that's okay, Coralie.